On December 3rd, 2024, China made an announcement that received almost no mainstream media coverage, no primetime discussions, no cable news debates, just a brief statement from Beijing's Ministry of Commerce that fundamentally altered America's strategic position overnight. China banned the export of gallium, germanium, antimony, and several other critical minerals to the United States, not restricted, not licensed, banned completely. Then in November 2025, after negotiations, they temporarily suspended these restrictions for 1 year as part of a trade deal with the Trump administration. But here's what nobody's discussing. That suspension is temporary. The legal framework remains intact, and more importantly, the suspension revealed exactly how dependent America has become on materials most people have never heard of. Because while politicians celebrated the temporary reprieve, the underlying reality didn't change. America cannot manufacture smartphones without these minerals, cannot build F-35 fighter jets, cannot produce ammunition, cannot fabricate semiconductors, cannot construct wind turbines or electric vehicles. The entire defense industrial base, the entire technology sector, the entire green energy transition, all of it runs on materials that one country controls, and that country just demonstrated it can turn off the supply whenever it chooses. Today, I'm going to walk you through how China built this chokehold, why it matters more than oil ever did, and why the temporary suspension changes nothing about America's strategic vulnerability. Because this isn't about trade negotiations, this is about the fundamental architecture of modern technology, and China controls it. Most people have never heard of gallium, germanium, or antimony. That's by design. These aren't consumer-facing materials. But every piece of modern technology you use, every advanced weapon system America deploys, every renewable energy project the government funds, all of it depends on these materials functioning invisibly in the background. Let's start with gallium. Gallium is essential for manufacturing semiconductors, specifically gallium arsenide and gallium nitride semiconductors, which are faster, more efficient, and handle higher power levels than traditional silicon chips. These are critical for 5G networks, satellite communications, missile guidance systems, and electronic warfare equipment. Without gallium, you cannot build modern telecommunications infrastructure. You cannot manufacture advanced military hardware. And the United States imports almost 95% of its gallium from China. Now, germanium. Germanium is used in fiber optic cables, the backbone of global internet infrastructure, and it's critical for infrared optics, night vision devices, and solar cells used in spacecraft. The U.S. imports 80% of germanium from China, which controls 60% of global production. Without germanium, America's telecommunications networks become vulnerable, military night vision systems lose their supply chain, and space programs face material shortages. And then there's antimony. Antimony might be the most strategically critical of all because it's irreplaceable in ammunition production. Since World War II, antimony has been key to defense technologies, critical in tungsten steel and hardening of lead bullets. Today, antimony is essential for armor-piercing ammunition, night vision goggles, infrared sensors, and precision optics. Colonel Stephen Power of Picatinny Arsenal testified that antimony trisulfide is an essential and non-replaceable component of American ammunition. Non-replaceable? There is no synthetic substitute. China accounts for 48% of global antimony production and 63% of U.S. antimony imports. The United States has no domestic antimony production. America cannot manufacture bullets without Chinese antimony, and China just banned its export. When China imposed antimony restrictions in September 2024, antimony shipments from China dropped 97%, while prices rose 200%. Rotterdam quotes for antimony, which traded near $11,300 per metric ton in January 2024, reached $57,178 by April 2025, a 400% increase. This is the largest price spike for any critical mineral during peacetime in recorded history, and it revealed something Washington didn't want to admit. American ammunition production is at China's mercy. Now here's where this gets even more uncomfortable. These three minerals are just the beginning. China also controls the global supply of rare earth elements. Rare earth elements are 17 metallic elements with unique magnetic, optical, and electronic properties. They're used in permanent magnets that power electric vehicle motors, wind turbine generators, hard drives, and precision-guided missiles. They're in your smartphone screen, laptop battery, and advanced weapons systems. And China currently dominates global rare earth production, accounting for over 69% of global mining. This dominance extends beyond mining, with China processing nearly 90% of the world's rare earth elements. But that 90% processing figure understates China's control because for certain types, China's dominance is even more complete. China accounted for around 60% of global rare earth mining in 2024, but China's dominance is even greater in separation and refining stages, representing about 91% of global production. And here's the critical detail. China has significantly strengthened its position in manufacturing rare earth-containing permanent magnets. 2 decades ago, China accounted for around 50% of sintered permanent magnet production. This share has risen to 94% today. 94%. China manufactures 94% of the high-performance magnets used in electric vehicles, wind turbines, industrial motors, data centers, and defense systems. This isn't market dominance. This is a near-total monopoly. Now let's talk about how China built this position, because this wasn't an accident. This was strategy. In the 1980s and 1990s, the United States led global rare earth production. But rare earth processing is dirty, expensive, and environmentally destructive. So over time, American companies offshored the work to China, where environmental regulations were lax and labor was cheap. China accepted. And then China executed one of the most successful resource consolidation strategies in modern industrial history. Beijing subsidized rare earth mining. It funded research into separation and refining technologies. It tolerated environmental damage Western countries wouldn't accept. It built processing facilities at a scale no other country could match. And then, once Chinese facilities dominated global processing, China started restricting exports, not of raw materials initially, of the processing technology and expertise. China banned the export of rare earth processing technology, and China imports rare earths from other countries and processes them, giving it a near monopoly. This is the brilliance of China's strategy. Other countries can mine rare earths. Australia has reserves. The United States has reserves. But mining the ore is only the first step. The ore must be separated into individual elements, refined to high purity, and fabricated into useful products like magnets. That processing requires specialized chemical facilities, technical expertise, and economies of scale that take decades to build, and China controls 90% of that capacity. So even if you mine rare earths in Australia or America, you still ship the ore to China for processing. Despite U.S. strategic investment, Brazil's Serra Verde rare earths project ore is already locked into offtake agreements with China for processing, because China's overwhelming dominance in midstream processing left no viable alternative. This is the trap. You cannot escape China's supply chain even if you develop your own mines, because there's nowhere else to process the ore. Every alternative ends up feeding back into Chinese control, and now China is tightening that control even further. In April 2025, China imposed export controls on 7 rare earth elements, requiring exporters to apply for licenses. Then in October 2025, China escalated further. China announced export controls requiring foreign companies to obtain a license from China to export parts, components, and assemblies containing Chinese-sourced rare earth materials or produced using Chinese rare earth technologies. This is the critical escalation most people missed. China isn't just controlling export of rare earths from China. From December 1st, 2025, the controls include internationally made products containing Chinese-sourced materials or manufactured using Chinese technologies, even if traded domestically. Think about what that means. If a Japanese company buys Chinese rare earth magnets and builds them into an electric motor, China now claims the right to control whether that motor can be exported, even though it was manufactured in Japan. If a European company uses Chinese processing technology to refine rare earths mined in Australia, China claims authority over the final product. This isn't trade policy. This is extraterritorial control over global supply chains, and the West has no answer because the dependence is too deep. As export volumes fell sharply in April and May 2025, Many car makers in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere struggled to obtain permanent magnets, with some forced to cut utilization rates or temporarily shut down factories. This already happened. American and European car factories shut down because China restricted magnet exports. Now, remember what I said at the beginning. In November 2025, China temporarily suspended many of these export restrictions as part of a trade deal. China suspended export restrictions on several rare earth elements, processing technologies, lithium battery materials, and other items announced on October 9, 2025. The rollback also extended to curbs on gallium, germanium, antimony, and other super hard materials from December 2024. This was presented as a diplomatic victory. But look closer at what actually happened. China's Ministry of Commerce announced the temporary suspension of export controls for 1 year beginning November 7, 2025 through November 10, 2026. 1 year. The suspension is temporary. The export control framework remains in place. It can be reinstated at any moment. And more importantly, certain restrictions remain in force, including prohibition of export of all dual-use items to U.S. military users or for U.S. military end uses, and controls on 7 medium and heavy rare earth elements. So even during the suspension, military applications are still blocked. Defense contractors still cannot access these materials for weapon systems. And here's what this really reveals. This was a transaction. China agreed to temporarily ease restrictions in exchange for tariff reductions, agricultural purchases, and other concessions. But the underlying power dynamic didn't change. China demonstrated it can shut off critical mineral supplies whenever it chooses. Then it graciously agreed to turn them back on temporarily for a price. Investors and policymakers should view the 2025-2026 suspension not as a surrender of control, but as a strategic reset. 1 year to build alternatives to supply chains that took China 40 years to construct. That's not a solution. That's a countdown. Now let's talk about why this matters more than oil ever did. For decades, control of oil defined geopolitical power. OPEC could influence markets. The United States fought wars to secure energy supplies. But critical minerals are different. Oil is fungible. Saudi oil, Russian oil, American oil, they're interchangeable. If one supplier cuts you off, you buy from another. Critical minerals aren't like that. Chinese gallium processing isn't the same as hypothetical American processing because America doesn't have facilities at scale. Chinese rare earth magnet manufacturing isn't replaceable by European alternatives because Europe doesn't have factories producing at Chinese volumes. The supply chains are non-fungible, and that gives China leverage OPEC never had. When OPEC raised oil prices in the 1970s, it caused economic pain, but didn't stop American technology from functioning. But if China cuts off gallium, American semiconductor production stops. If China restricts rare earth magnets, electric vehicle manufacturing halts. If China bans antimony, ammunition production collapses. This isn't economic pressure. This is supply chain interdiction, and it reveals something Washington hasn't fully confronted. America is no longer economically sovereign. For all the talk about American power, military dominance, technological leadership, the United States cannot manufacture the core technologies that define the 21st century without Chinese permission. China controls the materials, China controls the processing, China controls the supply chains, and every American factory, every defense contractor, every technology company operates at China's discretion. This is the new reality of geopolitical competition. It's not about who has the most aircraft carriers, it's about who controls the supply chains for critical technology, and China does. Now, why can't America just rebuild these supply chains domestically? The answer is time, cost, and scale. At the California Mountain Pass mine, advanced chemical separation and magnet production are not operational. The Defense Department has committed funds to build a mine-to-magnet chain by 2027, but that goal is far from assured, especially for heavy rare earths such as dysprosium and terbium, where China has a near-total monopoly. 2027 was the goal. And that's just for basic processing, not for achieving the scale and efficiency China built over 40 years. For antimony, Perpetua Resources has proposed plans to reopen the stibnite gold mine. The project is not scheduled to begin production until 2028. 2028, 3 years away. And even then, it would only produce enough antimony to supply roughly one-third of America's industry needs. The rest still comes from China, Tajikistan, or Russia. So even with government funding, even with fast-track permitting, America won't have sufficient domestic antimony production until 2028, and even then it covers only a fraction of demand. This is the time dimension of the problem. Supply chains offshored over 40 years cannot be rebuilt in 4, and every day that passes, China's position strengthens. In May 2025, Shenge Resources announced a binding agreement to acquire full ownership of the Australia-based Peak Rare Earths project in Tanzania. The deal was a $158 million AUD transaction, representing a nearly 200% premium over Peak's closing price. China is buying foreign rare earth projects at massive premiums to lock in future supply. While America tries to restart domestic production, China is securing control over rare earth deposits worldwide. This is a race America is losing. And here's the cost dimension. Even if America rebuilds these supply chains, they will be far more expensive than Chinese alternatives. China's vertical integration lowered costs, putting it far ahead of competitors. Chinese rare earth facilities operate at a scale that drives down per unit costs. Chinese factories don't face Western environmental regulations. Chinese state-owned enterprises receive government subsidies private Western companies cannot match. So even if America builds processing plants, American rare earths will cost more. American magnets will be more expensive. American products will be less competitive. Rebuilding supply chain sovereignty means accepting permanently higher costs, and it's not clear that American industry or consumers are willing to pay that premium. Now, let's talk about scale. China doesn't just control rare earth processing, China is the customer. China currently dominates the midstream and downstream supply chains for batteries globally, with shares of 80% or more in many key areas. China manufactures most of the world's electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, and consumer electronics. So even if other countries mine rare earths, even if they build processing facilities, where do they sell the output? The largest customers are Chinese manufacturers. This creates a trap. If you try to compete with China in rare earth processing, Chinese companies can simply refuse to buy from you and source domestically instead. Your facility sits idle because there's no market, or China can flood the market with cheap rare earths, driving prices below your production costs until you go bankrupt. This happened before. After the 2010 crisis, when China restricted rare earth exports to Japan, several Western projects launched. Molycorp in the United States went bankrupt. Lynas in Australia survived but remains a fraction of China's scale. The market couldn't support competitors because Chinese production was too cheap and too large. This is the fundamental problem. China didn't just build supply chains. China built an entire industrial ecosystem where mining, processing, manufacturing, and consumption all happen within Chinese borders or under Chinese control. Breaking out of that ecosystem isn't just expensive or slow. It might not be economically viable at all. And now we're seeing the strategic implications. In terms of strengthening military preparedness, China is operating in a wartime posture while the United States is operating in a peacetime posture. Even prior to the new restrictions, the U.S. defense industrial base lacked the capacity and surge capabilities to meet defense technology production needs. In a conflict scenario, if China cuts off critical mineral exports, American defense production collapses. America is already struggling to produce enough ammunition for Ukraine. Now imagine a scenario where China bans antimony exports entirely, not temporarily, permanently. American ammunition stockpiles drain, production lines halt, and there's no domestic alternative until 2028 at the earliest. In a protracted conflict, America runs out of bullets. That's not hyperbole, that's logistics. And it's not just ammunition. F-35 fighter jets require rare earth magnets in their electric motors. Aegis missile systems use rare earth elements in guidance systems. Satellites need germanium for solar panels. The entire American military is built on a foundation of Chinese materials, and China just demonstrated it can remove that foundation at will. This is the strategic absurdity. America spends $800 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined, But that spending is meaningless if weapons cannot be manufactured because materials are unavailable. All the aircraft carriers, all the stealth bombers, all the advanced missiles, they're built with Chinese materials. And if China decides those materials are no longer available, American defense contractors cannot fulfill contracts. This is dependency disguised as strength. So, what does this mean for the average American? Most people will never think about gallium or rare earth elements, but the consequences are visible. When the price of antimony trioxide more than doubled to over $39,000 per metric ton, the price hikes could increase the cost of end products like smartphones, computers, and automotive electronics. Every product using semiconductors becomes more expensive when critical mineral prices spike. Every electric vehicle becomes more costly when rare earth magnet supplies tighten. Every wind turbine, every solar panel, every piece of electronics, all of it depends on materials one country controls. And when that country restricts supply, prices rise. Companies either absorb costs, reducing profits and investment, or pass costs to consumers, making everything more expensive. There's no avoiding it. Dependence creates inflation, and the inflation is structural because the dependency is structural. Now let's assess what's actually happening. China imposed export restrictions in December 2024. Prices spiked, supply chains disrupted, American defense contractors and technology companies panicked. Then in November 2025, after negotiations, China temporarily suspended most restrictions for 1 year. The media framed this as a diplomatic victory, but that framing is wrong. What actually happened is China demonstrated total control, then agreed to temporarily ease pressure in exchange for concessions. The restrictions can be reimposed at any moment, and China learned exactly how dependent America is because the panic was immediate. Defense contractors are now desperately searching for alternative sources, but those alternatives don't exist at scale, won't exist for years, and may never achieve cost parity with Chinese production. So while the temporary suspension creates breathing room, it changes nothing about the fundamental dynamic. America needs these materials. China controls these materials, and every negotiation from this point forward happens under that reality. China doesn't need to maintain restrictions permanently. Just knowing China can reimpose them at will is enough. That knowledge influences every decision American companies make, every investment American policymakers consider, every strategic calculation American military planners conduct. This is leverage without action, and it's extraordinarily effective. Because now, every time there's a diplomatic dispute, every time tensions rise over Taiwan or the South China Sea, American leaders have to consider, what if China cuts off critical minerals again? That consideration constrains American options. It limits American responses. It forces compromise where compromise might not otherwise happen. This is the essence of economic coercion. Not punishing continuously, but demonstrating the capability to punish, then extracting concessions to avoid punishment. And here's the long-term trajectory. China's position is strengthening, not weakening. China has announced major export controls on lithium-ion battery supply chains, covering a broader range of battery materials, technologies, and equipment. They now include battery cells and packs for high-performance applications, cathode precursors, expanded scope of anode materials, and battery and material production equipment and technologies. China is extending control beyond raw materials into batteries, the technology that will power the 21st century economy. Electric vehicles run on batteries. Grid-scale energy storage uses batteries, and China controls the entire battery supply chain. In some segments, such as precursor cathode materials and LFP cathode materials, China maintains a near monopoly with shares of 95% or above. This is the future of Chinese leverage, not just control over rare earth elements, but control over the finished products those elements enable. Here's the uncomfortable conclusion. The temporary suspension doesn't solve anything. It buys time. 1 year. And in that year, American policymakers need to make a choice. Accept permanent dependency, acknowledge that critical mineral supply chains will remain in Chinese hands, and manage the relationship accordingly. This means avoiding conflicts that might trigger restrictions and making diplomatic concessions to maintain access, or rebuild domestic supply chains at enormous cost. spending hundreds of billions, accepting higher production costs, tolerating environmental damage, and waiting decades for results that may never achieve Chinese scale, or diversify to friendly nations, build processing facilities in allied countries, secure supply agreements with Australia and Canada, and create an alternative supply network. This is current policy, but it's not working fast enough. Simply diversifying sources of mined ore is not enough. Last year, the U.S.-led Mineral Security Partnership backed Brazil's Serra Verde project, yet the ore is already locked into offtake agreements with China for processing. The problem isn't mining, it's processing, and processing capacity takes decades to build. So realistically, America is choosing option 1 by default, because options 2 and 3 aren't achievable in any time frame that matters. The supply chains will remain under Chinese control for the next 10 to 20 years minimum. And that means American strategic options are constrained by Chinese decisions. This is the new structure of global power, not military dominance, not economic size, control over materials that enable modern technology, and China has that control. The suspension of export restrictions is temporary, the dependency is structural. And until that changes, every American technology company, every defense contractor, every electric vehicle manufacturer operates with Chinese permission. That's not sovereignty, that's subordination, and it's the reality nobody in Washington wants to acknowledge, but everyone is living with. So what's the lesson? This is about the architecture of the 21st century economy. For decades, the assumption was that globalization created interdependence benefiting everyone. Companies could source materials globally, optimize supply chains internationally, and specialize production wherever most efficient. That system worked when all participants had roughly equal leverage, but when one participant controls 90% of critical mineral processing, the system becomes asymmetric, interdependence becomes dependence, and dependence becomes leverage. China understood this earlier than anyone else. While American companies offshored production to maximize short-term profits, China played a long game. Build the infrastructure, dominate the processing, control the supply chains, and then, when dependency is complete, use that control strategically. This is what late-stage globalization looks like. Not mutual benefit, structural advantage, and the advantage lies with the country that prioritized long-term control over short-term efficiency. America now faces a choice it doesn't want to make: accept Chinese dominance over critical technologies or pay enormous costs to rebuild sovereignty. There's no good option. Only trade-offs between expensive and more expensive, between constrained and more constrained. And while policymakers debate, China is expanding control, not retreating. Expanding because the temporary suspension isn't a concession, it's a demonstration. China proved it can shut off the supply. Then China proved it can turn the supply back on for a price. That's not weakness, that's power. And America, for all its military strength, for all its economic size, for all its technological innovation, cannot manufacture modern technology without Chinese materials. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. It's not. The question is how long America will operate under this constraint before the cost becomes unbearable. Because every day that passes, every factory that gets built, every weapon system that gets designed, every product that gets manufactured, all of it deepens the dependency. And the deeper the dependency, the harder it is to break free. This is the trap. Not set maliciously, but built by America prioritizing efficiency over sovereignty, profits over security, short-term savings over long-term vulnerability, and now the trap is sprung. China controls the minerals, China controls the processing, China controls the supply chains, and America, for the first time in decades, is not in control of its own technological future. That's the reality the temporary suspension reveals, not relief, dependence. And dependence in a world of great power competition is the most dangerous position of all.